talk to you about the history of epidemiology. This is one of the areas that I find exciting. In fact, I find the whole course exciting, and I've taught it multiple times, as you know. I've never lost my enthusiasm for the topic because it always has a lot to say about common day practice. And we're going to find as I go through this that a lot of the things we're doing now are from centuries past. So I'm going to make some specific points, and one of the things I want you to concentrate on is John Snow. John Snow will come up, and there's so many elements of what John Snow did that we still use today, and comments about science that we can make that I will dwell on that, and I think we give you a reference for UCLA where you can go and learn more about John Snow. So we're going to cover the history of epidemiology. Now I want you to notice that this is by no means a brand new field. And oftentimes people believe that, and that's far from the case. Hippocrates, and I know that you've heard many things about Hippocrates in his contributions to our way of thought, really is known as the first epidemiologist. And he observed and described behaviors, and I've emphasized this before. Your ability to do that really separates you from your peers, and so you want to, if you can, develop those skills. And he linked clean air and water to longevity, even way back when that was a real concern. And from my standpoint, from being involved in Homeland Security, at this point in our history, biological warfare was already started in around 400 BC, where archers would dip their arrowheads in the blood of pests, meaning rats, fowl, or deceased warriors, and it was just another way of contamination. Now I'd like to talk to you about John Grant. I'm skipping a few years, as you can see. This is AD that we're focusing on, and he was famous for record keeping, and as a result of record keeping, noticing associations. And I know many of you are learning this process through your activities with research, and record keeping has been a central part of public health for quite a while, and this systematic recording and analyzing of mortality and morbidity by Grant was a precursor to the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, or the MMWR, which you can get for free. And just log on the internet and type in MMWR, or the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The MMWR Weekly Report contains data on specific diseases as reported by state and territorial health departments, and reports on infectious and chronic diseases, environmental hazards, natural or human-generated disasters, which we often don't think is a part of public health, but it is, and that's where Homeland Security fits in. Occupational diseases and injuries, intentional and unintentional injuries. So it's pretty comprehensive, and you can gauge what is the topic of importance at that particular moment. Also included are reports on topics of international interest and notices of events of interest to the public health community, and it's free, as I mentioned before. And I talk about the international because after 9/11, aircraft travel diminished significantly 3 months after 9/11, and as a result, the incidence of disease declined in this country. And I probably mentioned before that the Control of Communicable Disease Manual has increased over the years very dramatically because we are bound in a common destiny because of our transportation system and have influence one over the other because there's much more exposure as a result of travel. And so I just want to make you aware of that. And also there's an opportunity for prevention in terms of what you do during travel. I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on another element as we go along here. But Grant was famous for, and notice the word systematic recording and analyzing morbidity and mortality data. And you will find that we look at data by person, and you will be learning that through your projects, and you want the data in the same column or the same row depending on the software program that you use for data analyses. But he was already looking at the associations, the relationships, the correlations of morbidity and mortality because he was trying to look for determinants. Okay? Next, Grant developed the Bills of Mortality, which listed possible causes of death during the Black Plague. And remember, this was the Holocaust, and 25 million people throughout the world died. So this was an important contribution to science. And look what he analyzed. He analyzed demographic variables and their relationship to mortality. And you're going to find out throughout my presentations and throughout these slides that demographic variables are very important in a number of different ways as determinants to identify disease and help us look at preferred populations. Now you notice I use the word preferred. We used to use the word target populations, and it's grown out of popularity. And the reason, I think, is because targets remind us of warfare, and there's been a shift, obviously, and that term has fallen out of popularity. You can put in the thinking in between as to why that might occur. Okay. Now, the bills were the phrases used for the weekly and annual recording of births and deaths, which began in England in as early as 1538. And so that's what his bills included. Next, he calculated life tables and life expectancy tables, and we have those, and we will focus on those later on. And you will find out how America's doing, and I hope that you will be as outraged as I am in regards to how America is doing. Now, the next thing he is famous for is coining the terms acute and chronic. and we still use these classifications today. And so this should, you can see what the contribution was. These early leaders were very systematic in what they did in order to get on top of major problems that were confronting them, where they knew they couldn't treat one individual at a time. Now, there was another group that is known for their contributions, and that's John Snow, and no class is complete without understanding the contributions of John Snow and Ignaz Semmelweis. I was in the building one time, and surprisingly, the major focus of the presentation was on Semmelweis's contributions, and this was by a non-scientific person, and I was very interested about how he related it to several features related to daily living. But these guys introduced hypothesis testing, analysis, and explanation, and this is a part of epidemiology, as you know, and it's part of analytic epidemiology, and what we're really talking about is a system of thinking outside the box when you don't have all the details, trying to use whatever information you have in your past that you can bring to a particular situation that puts it into context. And we're constantly doing this in science. Some seem to do it better than others. We're looking for people who are good at systematic reasoning, and from that, can we develop a hypothesis? Sometimes our hypotheses are not substantiated. I can't tell you how many studies I've done that I thought things should proceed in a certain way, and they do not. That doesn't make any difference, because you're going to find out what the determinant is anyway. And after hypotheses development, you're going to go to testing, and then you're going to draw conclusions. And that's the analytic epidemiology concept. But if somebody says to you, what is analytic epidemiology? It is that, plus the application of epidemiologic statistics. Okay? And we're going to learn about those, and I think you'll enjoy them. But what we're talking about is just a thinking process. How are you going to get on top of something that is catastrophic and overwhelming, and you don't have the resources to really manage a problem? In the reading list, I showed you some of the books that one of the books that I had edited with my colleague Eric Dietz, and it's called Pandemic Planning. And we're working on a model whereby we can get agencies to plan in advance about what they're going to do under pandemic situations, because we don't want to have anything like the Black Plague overtake America, because we would lose so many different people. So, and we're starting on a second book on looking at events that are small, medium, and large, and what people ought to do in those circumstances as well. I don't want to go too much into that, but anyway, we're looking at the founders of modern epidemiology. Snow is just an enigma. I mean, he's an unusual guy. He was an English physician. He was a founder of anesthesiology, which, when you look at what he did in relationship to being the founder of anesthesiology, it's just really fascinating. Now, he was also gifted in anesthesiology. He was the first physician to calculate dosages for the use of ether and chloroform as surgical anesthetics, and the first to personally administer chloroform to Queen Victoria when she gave birth to two of her last two children. She had a total of 9, but anyway, so he was a gifted person who had done well in terms of anesthesiology. But something happened to him all of a sudden that was unexpected, and London was beset with a cholera epidemic. And this is the most often told story in public health, and of course would be replete without the mention of John Snow and his accomplishments. And John Snow is the first modern day epidemiologist, or also known as the grandfather of epidemiology. So he had a problem. He had a lot of people dying in a short period of time. He knew that he couldn't see them on one at a time. So he had to see whether he could identify the determinant that was causing these people, or determinants that were causing these people to become sick. He had to act on a population basis, on massive population basis. So not trained that way, he had to see what he could do to prevent, protect, and control a disease that was spreading, and I'll tell you more about that here in a second. Now, what was interesting, miasma or miasmic theory was the reigning theory at the time, and it had to do with the spread of disease through by bad air. That might have been more appropriate for other diseases that you will learn about that are spread through air, and as what happened in Philadelphia with the American Legionnaires. So he couldn't. This hypothesis was not particularly helpful for him, and so he came up with a different one by observation first, and I'll show you some of the methods that he used and how he observed things and how he put things together in a systematic way so he could draw conclusions and see where most people lived, and those people who were becoming ill and dying. And so drinking water was contaminated with fecal waste, and it had nothing to do with miasmic air or the theory of the miasmic theory in terms of the disease being related to air quality. Okay. He conducted a famous study, and it's often known as door-to-door epidemiology, and that's why the door is shown in the picture, and he went from house to house where consumers contained their water and asked about where they got water. Now, why he picked water, I don't know, but this guy was obviously very gifted, and he used the power and the benefits of observation, and again, which I think are so often overlooked. And if you get anything from this course, is I think we need to train people to look at different venues of how diseases occur, and very important that people have the power of observation, and they know the importance of it. And probably one of the most greatest scientists that use these techniques, looking at the behavioral sciences, was B.F. Skinner and his observations of lower organisms, and what he noticed in the way of reinforcement. It was amazing, because probably Skinner's methods have been the most influential in behavior change. Another example is The Beautiful Mind. I don't know whether you ever saw that movie, but the main character could make sense out of beads of lights and patterns where others could not. And great scientists often watch carefully, ask questions related to what they observe, and come to conclusions that others often overlook or don't see. They think differently, and we've done studies of people who are stellar in their field, and we find this same conclusion has been supported. I had an opportunity to watch Nobel Prize winners on public TV in the Bay Area, and it was the anomalies that they observed, the things that were out of character in terms of the paradigm they were working within, that advanced science. In other words, what they did is they avoided groupthink or conformity, and that's so important in terms of scientific advancement. So Snow, he observed and he walked and he talked and he gathered information, and we have ethnographic techniques that we use today, and we talk to people to learn from them what they can provide in the way of new information. It's a very powerful method in terms of medicine. I used to teach physicians at the Stanford Medical School, and I used to tell them the person that's going to provide you the most information and make you a success is the patient. And if you talk to them and can ask precise and incisive questions, your career will be greatly enhanced, and you will make a far bigger difference. Okay, now what I'd like you to notice here is person, place, and time. This is a cluster map, or this is a precursor to GIS, or Geographic Information System, and this is exactly what Snow did. He used little red dots, and he plotted where the deaths were occurring, and the water companies, there were a couple of them, and I don't want to go into those because I'd like you to read about them, and found out that more deaths were coming from one water company than another. And he looked at the person variables, approximate distribution of effective residents, where did it occur, place, and when, 1855. And this area of the city was called Soho, London. And Soho is an interesting part of London today, because it's where sex workers and the sex industry goes on. But anyway, that's a different story. And I want to show you what he was confronting. The number of deaths. He had approximately 500 deaths within 10 days, and the population at risk was huge. So he knew he had to get this problem under control. Now, this is called a common source epidemic. Here is a common source. All right, everybody was drinking from this particular well. And so the well is the common source. And what did what did Snow do? I mean, after you notice this distribution, what did he do? Well, first off, he resisted treating one person at a time. He just simply couldn't do it. He was overwhelmed. He turned his back on his medical training, not entirely, but mostly. Obviously, he was an anesthesiologist. He used record keeping and analytic epidemiology. He worked among the people. He didn't separate himself from them. He rejected miasmic theory, which was probably a very courageous thing to do because it was a common belief of the time. And that theory remained dominant far after his death. He used cluster mapping to plot cases or geographic information systems. We still do that. I know I was involved in the syphilis problem in Marion County, and we were number one in syphilis at one time, and we used a GIS system so we could look at we went to the jails and to the sex workers, and we also looked at the neighborhoods where the problems were occurring most. Snow used the simplest intervention that worked. He used Occam's razor, which is a principle of parsimony. And I'll tell you about what he did to get this problem to stop. But he was criticized for that too. He's criticized for everything he did, actually. This is no different than pioneers in science today. It hasn't changed any. He stood firm and was not swayed by the criticism he received from his colleagues. They thought he was a buffoon. He was uninformed. He broke with the norms of convention. And unfortunately, but it did occur, he was vindicated some 30 or 40 years after his death when Koch identified the determinant of cholera as bacteria. So oftentimes people who make significant contributions aren't revered, or they're not revered very soon, and often they're not revered during their lifetime. And I can tell you other instances of people that I have known that have made significant differences to science, and their work and actions are claimed by others who came after them and made the same discovery. Well, anyway, here's a slide about vibrio cholera and what it looks like, and I thought that might be interesting for you to see. And again, remember, the prevailing theory was miasmic or bad air, and that was the determinant of cholera. And scientists believed this for 30 years, even after, well, let me say it differently. Scientists believed that bad air or miasmic theory was the cause of cholera far after Koch had proven them wrong, and that it was due to cholera, vibrio cholera. And Koch won the Nobel Prize for identifying the determinant. Okay. This is what went on, and I had an opportunity to visit the pump in Soho, London, and I'm standing next to it there. But in 1854, Snow concluded that the Broad Street water pump was the main source, or the common source, of cholera. Snow later removed the handle. See, this is what I'm talking about, parsimony, or Occam's razor, OCCAM''S, razor. And the epidemic ended. Now, the problem was that his colleagues thought the that cholera was on its decline, so removing the pump handle really wasn't responsible for the changes that were observed. So they wouldn't even give him credit that way. So the epidemic was already declining, so removal of the pump handle was viewed to be of little consequence. And what I want to share with you, that if you contribute to science, you should expect criticism. And at the same time, it doesn't mean that you're incorrect. In fact, it may mean that you are ahead of your time. And success often comes with a price, and you may never get your just due before you are deceased. And I think that's just a real significant point. And so being a pioneer often comes with a cost. Now, close to here, and I don't think you can see it, is the John Snow pub. And it's off, I think it's back over in this area. And when I was there, it was under renovation, but they have a book under the bar where epidemiologists from all over the world come and sign in to indicate that they're a part of this movement of public health and recognize the contributions of Snow, which were so phenomenal. And if you just stop and think and you put yourself in Snow's position, what would you have done? Would you have been overwhelmed? This would have taken the totality of your knowledge, your background, your experience, and you would have been put in a place where you would have had to act, and you had to do so quickly. And for him to be able to come up with these measures in a short period of time, and the fact that we still use what he developed back then is just amazing to me. So we need to, I think, acknowledge and be very grateful to Snow for his pioneering efforts. Okay. Just a recap. Many people were skeptical because cholera incidence rate was already declining, as I mentioned. He had to deal with nearly 3,000 residents and confirmed their water originated from a common source pump. And then he published on the mode of communication of cholera. And you had to make your remark early in life, that was for certain. Snow died in 1858, shortly after the epidemic, at age 45. This is a book that he wrote, and I'd just like you to notice the credentials of Snow. He was a distinguished physician. He was a fellow of 2 organizations and vice president of the Medical Association of London, so he was by no means a buffoon, but probably seen that way by his colleagues. They were very skeptical of him. Likely they dismissed his contributions as non-scientific and the fortunes of serendipity. They may not have seen him as particularly credible because he was trained as an anesthesiologist, although he was gifted in this area too, but he was engaged in public health. Now, this is the London Times in July 3rd, 1849. Notice who is operating the water pump. That's the Death Angel, right? You see the crown and the arm operating the pump. The Death Angel, and she's holding, and who is there's a little gal Let's see if I can see the water coming down right here, and a little gal holding an urn. So she's gathering water for her family, perhaps, and a person drinking out of a cup. The rest are waiting their turn to get water and fill their containers with the contaminated water that's making them ill, and as a result, many of them dying. And if you get a chance, and I hope you do, go to the UCLA website and you can get the complete story about Jon Snow. I think it's just wonderfully exciting. You know, all of us are looking for heroes, and it's devoted to his life and times. And you know, he was born in 1813 and died in 1858. And you will learn about the Lambeth cholera epidemic. You'll learn about the contemporary history of bioterrorism and American anthrax outbreak of 2001 2001 also. When you're home alone, you know, and there's nothing good on television. I know that your time is busy, but go to this site rather than watching a movie. This will be more than a movie, and I think you'll come away very enriched and excited about what this gentleman contributed. I want to talk about Robert Koch. Koch is a guy that's given credit. He's a German bacteriologist who discovered cholera and vindicated Snow. But again, Snow's colleagues didn't change their mind. They were convinced it was miasmic theory. There's a couple of philosophers of science that I'd like to talk to you about, Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn. And I think this still goes on today, and this is why I bring it up to you. Kuhn thought that science advanced when the old guard died off, and not because of new information, which I think is really fascinating. And I think that often occurs. And, you know, we don't have best practices in medicine. I sat next to a traveling nurse. She worked in a children's oncology ward, and she says it was amazing. She'd worked 3 months in a given location, traveled to another one, about how much variation there was in treatment for the same disease. So obviously, science doesn't always catch up, and the practices aren't very similar in terms of how we go about treating something. But anyway, let me go back to Kuhn and Popper. Okay, so Kuhn, he says, well, when the old guard dies off, when the old guys are gone, and they no longer can influence thought, then a change occurs. Karl Popper, his idea was we're obligated to attack the problem at the heart. In other words, let's develop the most critical tests that we can so we can move science as quickly as possible. I mentioned that Koch won the Nobel Prize for his knowledge of biology and the mode of transmission, and he developed procedures for preventing and controlling cholera epidemics. Ignaz Semmelweis improved hospital. He was working in a maternity ward at a general hospital in Vienna. I think this is really interesting. In puerperal causes, or childbirth fever, killed 50% of the mothers in the general hospital. So this is what they were confronted with. And the death rate was 3 times higher in wards staffed by medical students. Now, as I mentioned, puerperal means related or caused by childbirth, and here's another person that lived a short time. He lived 47 years. Now, I don't want you to think that the longevity was just short in prior centuries. It's short in some places in the world, and we have many places in the world where people still don't live longer than 47 years. So, okay. Here's his hypothesis. Students should not wash hands after working with cadavers or patients. So this is what the medical students didn't do. Now what we're doing is we're looking at the analytic process again. So he had a test. Soak hands in chlorinated lime solution before they delivered babies. Okay, and this is a intervention that follows Occam's razor. Doesn't cost a lot, it's inexpensive, it's quick, it's effective, and that's what we're trying to look for in public health, always. Okay, the results: maternal mortality decreased from approximately 120 deaths per 1,000 live births to 12 deaths per 1,000 live births in just 7 months. Now, I know you're struggling, you're going to struggle with this the way it's written because you're probably not very familiar with it. But we will talk about what we mean, but you can compare the numbers 120 and 7 very easily. And then this is a constant, and I will talk to you about these constants are reference groups. And so I shouldn't say you can compare 120 and 7. I should say you can compare 120 and 12 deaths in just a 7-month period. And all they did was soak their hands in chlorinated lime solution. Medical community still favored miasmic theory. So you can see what the thought was, no matter bacteria was not something that was well accepted or known or revered as a cause. Now, proper hand washing. Now, I know that I provide you in the book information from the CDC about hygiene and this our proper hand washing, and the reason I do this is because this is such an important strategy that follows Occam's razor and makes such a difference. We have data that show that 50 to 65% of the people wash their hands after using the restroom, but most do so improperly. And we're in the process of, we've identified a videotape, but we think we're going to make another one because it comes from the CDC, but it's incomplete. Most don't know about the procedures of hand washing or doing it correctly. And so we want to acquaint you with that. These are very inexpensive depictions of how to wash hands that could be posted, as you see in the manual. And it needs further explanation, but certainly a lot more concentration. I know when my parents were in their 80s, I introduced hand washing to them, and we talked about and when they should wash their hands and how they should wash their hands, and their disease incidence went down by 70% because we grafted. and just really an inexpensive way of the control of disease. And as I remember, the average person touches their face 17 times per hour with their hand, and your hands go everywhere and touch everything. So your self-contamination is pretty frequent. Now, here's what we talk about. We talk about wetting your hands and wrists with warm water. So we're trying to, in other words, you're trying to scrub for surgery. You want to go up your wrists about 2 or 3 inches. You want to scrub between your fingers. You want to scrub your fingernails well. So you really want to scrub all surfaces, the backs of your hands and everywhere very well, so that you can make certain that your hands are decontaminated. Friction helps too. So the harder you rub, the better off you are. Some people say, well, I don't like to do that because it dries my hands out. Well, then use lotion afterwards. There's a lot of variation about how long you should scrub your hands. Let me just give you some of the recommendations. One of them is to sing happy birthday 2 times, and that's about 40 seconds. We've looked at the research literature, and it varies from 40 seconds to a minute, so we say go for a minute. I mean, you're only going to add 20 seconds to your day, and you may add a lot of productive time that you would have lost due to illness. Okay, and here's all these things that I've just mentioned, and I know you're following along, so you're seeing them. And again, we're following Occam's razor. Cheap, simple, effective. Okay? Dry your hands with a clean towel. Now, use a towel to turn off the faucet and to open the bathroom door. But let me back up. Once you wash your hands, you need to get a dry towel, and then you need to turn off the faucets. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you're recontaminating yourself. And so it's very important that you turn off the faucet and then dry your hands. Okay, so these are the common ones listed. We're listing them as they're advocated, but that's not the proper way. And use that towel to open the bathroom door, and if you can't find a place to drop the towel, find a waste paper can down the hall or someplace else where you can deposit the towel. And some bathrooms are set up that you have to pull the door, so you want to use that towel. Otherwise, that's a contaminated area. That's a fomite, and we'll talk a lot more about fomites. And or some bathrooms are set up that the door opens outward, so use your hindquarters to back your way out of the bathroom, or to back your way into the bathroom, depending on how it's arranged. And yes, keep your hands away from your face. And yes, proper etiquette is to cough into your sleeve. And when some of these things aren't available, use alcohol-based hand cleaners. Perel seems to be the best brand, thought to be most effective. And if you have a choice between, and some places you do, between a paper towel and a hand dryer, use a paper towel. And if you have to use a hand dryer, rub your hands together to create friction, because this also helps to decontaminate. So the best soap is a paper towel, and to dry your hands thoroughly, causing friction if you can. Okay. I'm going to introduce to you, and I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to read to you a story about Typhoid Mary, and there's a important message here, but we're going to read the story anyway, and then I will summarize what we found from that experience. The reader will be Michael Johnson.
An Irish cook, Mary Mallon, referred to as Typhoid Mary, was believed to be responsible for 53 cases of typhoid fever in a 15-year period. In the early 1900s, 350,000 cases of typhoid occurred each year in the United States. George Soper, a sanitary engineer studying several outbreaks of typhoid fever in New York City in the 1900s, found the food and water supply no longer suspect as a means of transmission of the typhoid disease. Soper continued to search for other means of communication of the disease. He began to look at people instead of the fomites and the food and water. He discovered that Mary Mallon had served as a cook in many homes that became typhoid-stricken. The disease always seemed to follow but never preceded her employment. Bacteriological examination of Mary Mallon's feces showed that she was a chronic carrier of typhoid. Mary seemed to sense that she was giving people sickness, because when typhoid appeared, she would leave with no forwarding address. Mary Mallon illustrated the importance of concern over the chronic typhoid carrier causing and spreading typhoid fever. Like 20% of all typhoid carriers, Mary suffered no illness from the disease. Epidemiological investigations have shown that carriers might be overlooked if epidemiological searches are limited to the water, food, and those with a history of the disease. From 1907 to 1910, Mary was confined by health officials until released through legal action taken by her. The New York Supreme Court upheld the community's right to keep her in custody and isolation. Typhoid Mary was released in 1910, and she disappeared almost immediately. 2 years later, typhoid fever occurred in a hospital in New Jersey and in a New York hospital. More than 200 people were affected. It was discovered that Typhoid Mary had worked at both hospitals as a cook, but under a different name. This incident taught public health officials and epidemiologists that close supervision and keeping track of carriers is essential. It also showed that typhoid carriers should never be allowed to handle food or drink intended for public consumption. In later years, Typhoid Mary voluntarily accepted isolation. Should she have wished, Mary could have had her gallbladder removed, which provides a cure in 60% of all typhoid carriers. Typhoid Mary died at age 70. The investigating, tracking, and controlling of certain types of diseases which can affect large populations were epidemiological insights gained from the Typhoid Mary experience. The protection of public food supplies was again reinforced, as were investigative aspects of the disease control, and both were made more justified and more important to public health.
Michael, for that reading. I think there were some very important things that we learned, and I want to review those with you. As you can see, Michael's covered the information on this slide very thoroughly, and you'll remember Mary Mallon. And I also wanted to add that in the early 1900s there was 350,000 cases of typhoid per year, and 20% of all of those with typhoid fever were carriers. And one of the most important things that came out of this is that they quarantined Mary, and that was a new procedure that was used to safeguard the public. Found it important not to let such people handle food or drink intended for public consumption. And insight was the importance of investigating, tracking, and controlling certain types of diseases which can influence large populations. And another factor that I think that was significant that in this reading was that the removal of the gallbladder provides a cure in 60% of the cases. Typhoid Mary is an example of a term that you will be learning more about, and that's a false negative, someone who really has a disease but tests negative. So they can have a very profound effect on the spread of disease. I want to go on with the history of public health. I mean, it's very interesting, and you'll find that a lot of things aren't particularly new, and that we've utilized them for years. And now, the first significant event, one of those that I'm drawing on, and I could draw on any number. There are multiple ones available that I think are just absolutely interesting. The Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies in 1639 mandated the use of vital statistics. And I think we've talked about vital statistics before, so you ought to be able to think about them very quick and have them memorized at this point. But we mean anything from birth to death, or any event, major event in your life where you get a certificate. So you get a birth certificate, you get a marriage certificate, you get a separation certificate, and legal separation is recognized in most states, including in Indiana. The only 7 states that don't allow a legal separation are Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and Texas. And a legal separation is when a married couple makes a binding agreement about how to manage their affairs and assets while living apart, but do not get a divorce. And then you get a divorce decree or certificate, and you get a death certificate. Okay? So vital statistics became a central part of the recording system and vital to public health. Now, quarantine, we know, was executed with Mary Mallon, but legislation was passed as early as 1701 in regards to smallpox patients. Quarantine was major because it signified government intervention regarding illness. Restraints were placed on ill people, and this was quite a change in terms of the government involvement in health and safety. England still has ill feelings about involvement by the government for any reason in health, and one of those is with fluoridation. Um, Now, look at this. It wasn't until 1842 that we really talked about health promotion and disease prevention, so that's not a new term at all. I can remember that health promotion and disease prevention were new terms on the Purdue campus in 1982. There were six of us who initiated the first program section called Health Promotion and Disease Prevention under the leadership of Roger Seehafer, who's now an emeritus faculty member. And I sort of laugh because the concept only took 140 years to come to Purdue, and we were one of the first programs in the nation that instituted the utilization of those terms and identifying a program that talked about those principles. And what I'm trying to get across is time delay is not unusual in science. Scientists and artists often have more acclaim after they are deceased. I'd like to talk to you about it wasn't until the 1850s that Shattuck wrote of the Massachusetts Sanitary Commission, which marked the beginning of community health. The public health program here on this campus focuses on community health, and in that report he emphasized the following, and you will notice that these are things that are happening on in our world today. State and local health departments. We have a state health department on, I think it's on 6th Street here, and you know about vital statistics and sanitation inspection and school health programs. The CDC has a large school health program, and we're a little more reluctant in the area of mental illness. That was really influenced greatly during the Reagan administration, but a high focus on alcohol abuse and tuberculosis. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of what we think is new and novel was formulated a long time ago. And I think about the sanitation inspections and the monitoring of environmental hazards, and for example oil spills by the oil fiasco by British Petroleum Company. Now, you'll note here that Massachusetts and California established the first boards of health in 1869 and 1870, respectively. And they focused on inspection of housing, public education, and hygiene. I want to talk just a bit about hygiene because this is a word that we've let slip by, and it's a very important word. And hygiene refers to a set of practices associated with the preservation of health and healthy living. So why we've let that word go, I'm not certain, but I would hope that you will use that word in your vocabulary because it's very descriptive, and it's tells a story very well. Now, what else? Investigation of disease, and regulating slaughterhouses, and we talked about the transmission of animals transmission of disease from animals to humans. And we talked about monitoring prisons and health care for the poor. Well, we didn't really talk about monitoring prisons, but in health care for the poor. So this was a big change to institute a board of health. There were not many. The problem was there were not many regulations, but a lot of responsibility. They had to use advocacy and not lobbying to make change. And health departments were often looked down upon, as they are today, because only having a few employees and only having a few employees trained in public health. The Public Health Act of 1848, health boards came from England and Wales and were initiated between 1848 to 1894 for rural areas, primarily in response to cholera epidemics. Their focus was sewers, clean streets, and slaughterhouses. And the Public Health Act of 1875 from the United Kingdom was established to combat filthy urban living conditions which cause the spread of diseases such as cholera and typhus. Sewage was flowing down the streets daily, and if you go to Mexico, you can still see some of this occurring. Not as bad as it was a few years ago. So these are sort of some of the things that were coming up and that are still in place today as a result of these early innovators. Now, I want to go into a more of a modern day significant change in public health. Now you'll notice that in 1947 that statistics originated in Iowa after World War II, and there was a guy by the name of Sir Ronald A. Fisher. He was an Englishman educated at Cambridge who created modern statistics. And Iowa is, of course, a land-grant institution, and they would divide crops up into quadrants, and they would use different methods to see whether one method would produce a better crop with fewer diseases and more produce or more production, and whether that was statistically significant from one plot to another. And if you go to the statistics department, I think it's on the fifth floor, and it hangs on the end of the building. They talk about Florence Nightingale, of course, a nurse, whose picture hangs there in the math building here at Purdue as making major contributions to statistics. So in this country, statistics really took a foothold when they started planting crops in quadrants and determining which grew the best. And as a land-grant institution, which Purdue is, there was a town and gown relationship where faculty were to help farmers with the production and growing of crops.